Hello and welcome to this Fame online event. I'm Jessica Andrews, author of Saltwater, which was published in 2019, and Milk Teeth, which will be published later this year. I'm very excited to be here with Saba Sams today to talk about her short story collection, Send Nudes. Saba's stories have been published in The Stinging Fly, The Tangerine, and Five Dials, among others. She was shortlisted for the White Review Short Story Prize in 2019, and she lives in London. Hi, Saba.
Hi, thanks for having me.
It's very nice to chat to you. I really loved your collection. And the first thing I wanted to ask you about is actually the epigraph. So, the epigraph to your collection is a quote from Veronica by Mary Gateskill, which is, "Yes, we were stupid for disrespecting the limits placed before us, for trying to go everywhere and know everything. Stupid, spoiled, arrogant. But we were right too." And I thought that was such a brilliant epigraph and kind of really fitting for all of the characters in your stories, as they're all kind of, to me, trying to leave their bodies or their situations or themselves, um, which is not always necessarily a negative thing. And I just wondered if you could talk about why that quote spoke to you and how you feel it kind of grounds your collection.
It's interesting. I remember reading that book after I'd written the collection, reading Veronica by Mary Gateskill, and the quote just jumped out at me, and I was like, I think that's what I've been trying to do this entire time. And it was so it's not like the epigraph came first or inspired the stories, but yeah, I really think that what was setting out to do when I wrote the collection was write about the way that young women have to just throw themselves into or out of situations and out of their bodies, out of their families, out of their relationships. Um, and it takes a real bravery, I think, and that's what that quote did for me. It kind of was like just brought like condensed down this idea that really we young women act in ways that are selfish or stupid or even sometimes cruel. And really, when you're growing up under like capitalism and patriarchy, there isn't actually another option. It's like I was thinking about how kind of evil women are having such a moment in the culture and why we're also obsessed with women that behave badly and do bad things. And I think it's because it's relatable because I was a horrible teenage girl and a lot of us were, and it's what happens when you grow up, uh, when you feel that you there is a very small box made for you of beauty standards, be it, or even personality, like this idea of the bubbly sweet young woman. And if you don't fit into that, you grow up feeling that you don't fit, and that kind of makes you bitter and twisted, and then you force your way out. I think there's no other there's no other alternative. I think that's what drew me in to that quote. The real, yeah, the courage of it, the courage to act in a way that has not been laid out for you, which comes from not being able to act in the way that has been laid out for you. Like very few women fit into that box. And yeah, I think I think that's what I that's what I was trying to say with my stories, and that's what that Mary Gateskill quote does for me.
Yeah, as a reader, I think I really felt and appreciated that. And I think your characters aren't really concerned with being likable. Maybe they want to be liked by the people they're obsessed with, or but it doesn't always feel like they're seeking approval in the world in a way that I found like quite refreshing, even though they are very concerned with how the world perceives them, and maybe that how that's sometimes disconnected from the way that they feel personally. Because a theme that really came out for me was a feeling of kind of like dislocation in the world, or maybe the way that you see yourself, and how that's often dissonant with the way that you're perceived in the world. And I'm thinking particularly, I guess, the protagonist in Send Nudes, kind of the title story. Um, she, just to kind of give a very brief synopsis of it, it's the whole story is kind of centered around her taking it like a naked selfie to send to a stranger on a dating app. And I felt like, yeah, that feeling of the way we feel in our bodies compared to the way that the outside world sees us, kind of mediated through the internet, was something that felt very true to life. So I wondered if you could talk about that feeling of kind of like connection and disconnection, or the dissonance maybe between the way that we feel in our bodies and the way that the outside world perceives us, and maybe why you wanted to explore that.
Mm, yeah, yeah, I completely know what you mean. And it is interesting to hear you say mediated through the internet, because the internet is such a strange way of perceiving yourself and being perceived by others. It's like choosing your outfit, but elevated or completely surrealized, um, in terms of choosing your selfie, or choosing like the way that your Instagram account's going to look or whatever it is. Um, yeah, we've got like a kind of hyper real way of seeing ourselves now, or and I think images. I'm thinking about images and about particularly women in the media, and it, when I think back, and I think this comes up quite a lot in the collection, there is being a young woman for me, and being a child is so like associated with this overflowing constant imagery that was like hitting me all the time. And that there's actually a scene in Send Nudes where I think she's trying to imagine her body, um, with her eyes closed, and it's completely changing shape. It's like, moving between bigger and smaller and bigger and smaller and bigger and smaller, and she can't pinpoint exactly where she is. And that's like a real experience that I felt a lot when I was younger, and I think I still feel it now. This like inability to see yourself, which I think has always existed, you know, but particularly exists when imagery is such a huge part of the way that we see women. And yeah, and it's just, and yeah, and the way that, I think I realized when I was like 15 and the Kardashians rose to fame, how powerful imagery is in making you see your body. Because before that it was all like the Kate Mosses, and I was like a big kid and I always wanted to be tiny. And then there was the Kardashians, and I was like, oh, like maybe I'm desirable now, but that also didn't feel good. And and I think, yeah, there's like this toxic set of beauty standards that is reinforced by imagery all the time. And then when you think of your own body or your own self within the world, it can't not be built with the house of those images.
Yeah, that's a really good way to phrase it, to built with the house of those images. I'm really glad you picked up on that part in Send Nudes, because I actually really wanted to ask you about that. I'm gonna read the quotation of the bit that you just talked about, because I felt like it was very, very true I think, to my own experience of inhabiting like a woman's body. So it's whenever she closes her eyes and imagines her body, she expands and contracts to the beat of a pulse, moving between very thin, thinner than she has ever been or could be, and then very fat, so fat she would have to be lifted from bed by a crane. In turn, she avoids looking directly at her body. She would probably not be able to see it as it is. If she did see it as it is, that could be worse. And yeah, I thought that did really speak to the way that we're like fed so many images of our bodies, and those images of the way that our bodies should be or we're made to feel they should be eclipse the actual like reality of our experience.
Mm-hmm.
um and just in general, I love that. I feel like your writing has a very kind of like sticky bodily aspect to it. And I wondered if you could talk about kind of your interest in the body in your work, and kind of why you've wanted to portray it in a way that has a kind of viscerality to it.
Um, it just occurred to me then when you were talking, just one final point on that last quote. I guess I am interested in the camera and the selfie lens and the way that, even in the mirror, you can make your body look a certain way and you will never see your body in the way it really looks. And I guess all of this social media and selfie taking and obsession with bodies is like built around that seed, which is that we will never truly see ourselves. And um and i i think i think that's interesting. And yeah, onto the stickiness, which is a word I love. um I mean, I guess for me the opposite of our desperation to see ourselves, or our desperation to see ourselves in a way um that is cleaner, or um more defined by the beauty standards that we want to meet. The opposite of that is grossness and stickiness, and all of the real hidden parts that are involved with being in a body. And um I think I couldn't have walked down the other path in my stories without going down that one too. um and it was such a huge part of growing into a woman's body for me. Being confronted with that grossness of like periods and discharge and body fat, and all of this stuff that we're taught to hide. um and I did hide it, and then it just kind of came up in my stories. It just like came to the surface, um because it was so there. It was such and the hiding it makes it bigger, obviously. um like being convinced that you're going to bleed through your school skirt, and like all of that stuff that is so normal, and yet so hidden. And it did feel defining, I think. M- More defining even than the unreal images and um the fakeness of the world of women in the media that we're fed. That just the difference is so sharp and so noticeable when you're kind of in the toilet with your actual body, compared to when you're um scrolling your phone. um which seems like such a basic point, but it's so true. It's so shocking to me, the complete reversal of our bodies in front of our eyes.
Do you think as well that in kind of leaning into those kind of gross aspects in your writing, it's a way of kind of like I don't want to say celebrating it because that sounds kind of trite, but it's a way of like sitting with those feelings and it being okay. You know, kind of like acknowledging it and holding it and maybe pushing back against the like shiny veneer of things.
Hmm. Yeah, yeah. I think words like real and normal are are what come what come to mind for me when I think of the grossness. Like it's almost weird that it's like some kind of political point, because it's yeah. Um yeah, I think it's definitely a way of sitting with it. I think yeah, I feel kind of weird about the like celebrate, these words like celebration and like power, and like I guess they've just become so overused or used by companies that they've like lost meaning. But yeah, I like the idea that it's something that we're sitting with the stories. It just it's a yeah it's it, I yeah I couldn't have written about the reality of being a young woman without going there. um yeah.
Yeah. Um, I also wanted to ask you just kind of about the basic genesis of your stories. Like when you're writing a story, what comes to you first? Is it the themes? Is it the setting? Is it the characters? And how do you find your characters? Because your collection moves through kind of like lots of lots of different protagonists coming from lots of different places in the world, and I was just wondering how you go about finding them or building them.
Mm. I think interestingly, the first line comes to me first quite a lot with short stories. And that's the amazing thing about short stories for me, is the first line can come and then you can just go from there. And I'm trying to write a novel at the moment, and it's really not how it works. And it's yeah, I was really experimenting when I wrote those stories. That's what I was doing. And often a character would just or yeah, a character or a scene would just be a reaction to what I'd written before. I think I was really looking to excite myself about writing and not let myself get bored. Um, and that's another great thing about short stories for me. I'd write it while I was liking it, and then when I started finding it boring, I'd just like throw in something completely different, and that feels doable in the space of a week. And and but yeah, I can still think of like the first lines of some of the stories that are still the first lines of some of the stories that have come to me. I remember like being on a roundabout just outside Hammersmith Station with like four different lanes all around me, and I was in the middle trying to cross the road. And the first line of Tenderloin came to me, or the first few lines, um, and that was kind of that was it really. The characters, interestingly, and come to me through the story, come to me as I write. I think they're never fully formed, and they're the things that probably change the most. Like when I finished a story, then I'll be like, no, she wouldn't have done that. She wouldn't have reacted like that. And that's what changes the course of the story more in the editing. Um, but no, I don't know if a whole character could just walk into my head. Like, it's like getting to know a person, isn't it? It takes a lot of movement to see them fully.
Yeah, I think that's very true about writing, that you kind of have to keep exciting yourself. And usually if you've lost interest in what you're writing, then your reader will too. I think that can
Mhm.
be the challenge sometimes, to kind of keep yourself feeling like, yeah, really like keyed into it and feeling excited by it. um, I guess I'm also interested in the idea of voice, because a lot of the protagonists of your story are like young women or teenage girls, but they all feel quite distinct from each other. And I'm also really interested in, I feel like you're writing, particularly a story like Tenderloin, has an almost like slightly otherworldly, fabulistic quality to it. But then you kind of bring the reader like quite jarringly back into the present with like a pop culture detail. Like you might talk about like Smirnoff Ice or Blue Wicked, or, and I feel like that works really well together because it kind of allows you to be fully immersed within the world of the story, and to kind of, and then to realize that it is a reality that's very close to the real world. And it kind of like allows you to look at the real world through a slightly different lens. I think it's a kind of like play between maybe like a kind of defamiliarization and the familiar. And I was just wondering if that feels true to you, or if that's something that you think about when you're writing.
That's really interesting to hear. It definitely feels true to me, but it's not something I've really thought through. I was thinking just then about like kind of my favorite books, or the books that inspired the collection, or the books that I read while I was writing, and like Salvage the Bones by Jesmyn Ward, and like Elmet by Fiona Mosley. And these books do also do this. Um, they feel, yeah, they feel kind of mythical, I think, and yet at the same time are like grounded in the now, and the lives of young people right now. Um, and I didn't really realize that I was doing it. I don't think. I think like those are the books that I look up to, and I guess was, that were in my head a lot. So it makes sense that that's what I do. Um, yeah, I guess I'm also drawn to, um, I'm like the countryside, or like kind of hippie spaces, or like the festivals, like creating a world that feels outside of the world, and yet has these like pop culture references surfacing. Um, I think sometimes I slightly feel like that's how I grew up, um, and it's interesting just thinking about what gets through to you as a child. Like what you pick up on and what comes through, and what like surfaces, like whether it's MTV or yeah, a pack of crisps or whatever. Um, because that's why I think I like writing children and younger teenagers, because the detail can feel so, um, it can feel like quite sudden. I think just the things that young people pick up on, because they're not. I think about it with my son all the time. I'm like, how did he remember? He's 3, and I'm like, how did he remember that he left that rice cake behind the sofa? And it's because they're not thinking about anything else. That's and these. Yeah, I think what surfaces for a child is really interesting to me, and particularly when you take them outside of the world.
Yeah, I think that comes across really strongly, especially in your story, The Mothers and the Girls. There's a real, I think you hold very well kind of the girls' perspective on their world and what's going on, but also as a reader, we very much understand the lives of the mothers in a way that perhaps their daughters don't.
Hmm.
Um, and yeah, I guess maybe also setting your stories in spaces that are slightly on the outside, like festivals or places like that. Maybe they give you a bit of freedom as well, because it's kind of like the ordinary rules are slightly suspended,
Hmm.
maybe.
Yeah, completely. I remember actually I wrote that when I was doing my masters, and I like handed it in as part of a creative writing workshop. And my teacher was just like, this is a really great world for a short story because anyone can come in, like they can bump into the mothers at any time. And it feels it feels freer. And that story did happen quite quickly and like relatively easily because of that. Because yeah, you have these freedoms that you might not have as a writer in another setting. um and I love that. I love making it easy, not have to worry about sending a text, or like that's something that in Here Alone, if you remember that story, um it was there was so much push and pull between like, would she text him? Would he text her? How are they going to actually find themselves in the same place at the same time in this big city, in the world of dating where often, you have one date and then nothing comes of it or whatever. Um, yeah, like balancing ghosting, but also having some sense of plot is really hard. And yeah, and the mothers and the girls, that wasn't an issue, which was nice.
I also really love your exploration of power. So I feel like that's really key to your collection. Like your characters are always in dialogue with their own power or the power of other people and how to navigate those two things. But I particularly liked your exploration of like power dynamics between women. I feel like there's a real kind of darkness in your portrayal of like femininity or like um, yeah, the relationships between the women in your stories. And it's kind of like they often kind of maybe desire each other, maybe it's kind of ambiguous, they kind of like deeply admire each other, but there's also a lot of jealousy and competition as well, in a way that I think feels true, but perhaps like people are a bit scared to talk about that.
Mm.
And I wondered, yeah, why you felt like you wanted to kind of show all of those different dynamics of relationships, particularly between women, but between all your characters, I suppose.
Mm. Yeah, I guess I knew with all my stories that I really wanted to foreground relationships between women over relationships between women and men. I think I like have definitely had moments where I've been like, I can't write complex male characters at all, and then felt really weird about that, and then been like, well, maybe that's just not my job with this book. Like that's not who I'm paying attention to here, and that's fine. Um, and yeah, so I think the emphasis was always on the women characters. And yeah, I mean, I think I was kind of saying this at the beginning, but I really wanted to write um, women who were gross and mean and jealous. And I think that that behavior comes from a place of um, wanting to wanting to grow into a certain person and not being able to grow into that person, and or wanting to grow into a certain woman and then seeing that woman who is, it happens all the time. You meet people who you want to be, and it's how we react to them that is interesting, I think. Like jealousy, or falling in love, or trying to make them your best friend, or trying to dress like them, or whatever it is. um, I think that, yeah, the structures that we live under as women and the way that that impacts upon our relationships between other women um, was like a big part of this collection for me. And it happens from so young, I think. Like I remember idolizing teenage girls from the age of like 4, and kind of, you kind of inherently know that you're not going to become them, and that creates it. Yeah, it's just like it's kind of painful. It's and what that does to you as a personality as you're growing up. It's interesting. And then I think, most of us get to a place, or I've definitely got to a place where you see the dynamics of it working, and you see who profits off your insecurities, and it's not you. And as adults, we can see slightly more clearly the the world that we're living in, and the way that our feelings are created. Um, but as a child, it really is as simple as like falling in love with your older sister's best friend or whatever. Um, yeah.
I think maybe it also is in keeping with what you were saying earlier about kind of sitting with the sticky and uncomfortable aspects of our bodies, kind of like in opposition to this sort of like shiny, clean feminism that we're presented with. And maybe we're also presented with this idea of like sisterhood and everyone supports each other and isn't
Mm,
it great? Whereas that kind of doesn't leave much room for like, what if you're jealous of someone? What if you love your best friend but you also hate them? What if you kind of desire them and you don't know what to do with that? Do you feel like maybe, yeah, within the kind of like shiny sisterhood narrative, we kind of like erase those things in a way that is potentially a problem?
hmm Yeah, absolutely. I think that's a really good point. Um, yeah, yeah. I mean, it was just International Women's Day yesterday, and I was feeling that a lot. Like, you know, in the morning you're like, oh, it's International Women's Day, and then by 2 p.m. you're like, oh my god, let's just there's so it's yeah. There's a lot of that. There's a lot of just like very shiny, very clean. Um, Did you see that, like, I think it's She Saw It First, some big sweatshop brand are giving out anti-spiking tests with every order?
Yeah.
Did you see this?
Yeah.
It's just like, I mean, that's off topic, but um, any time relationships between women, or yeah, anything to do with women is like sanitized um, by big companies. My reaction to it is like, I just want to write about two women who hate each other. You know what I mean? It's like it's an almost visceral reaction, I think, to write about bad, gross, bitchy women, and um, it brings me some sense of freedom, I think.
Yeah, and it gives gravitas to those experiences and kind of like says that these aspects of being a woman are also like true and valid and worth exploring. And I think, yeah, like thinking of kind of the antithesis of shininess and cleanness, going back to your writing style, I think like the actual way you use language and your images, they kind of like your characters, the voices are often quite deadpan, but they kind of like the way you structure certain phrases, it sort of exposes like the smallness and the mundanity of the world, but kind of often the joy cut beneath it, but the violence cut beneath it too. So I'm going to read a few quotes, a few of your lines, if you don't mind, because I think they're great. So one from Tinderloin: the whole garage smelled of copper, like after opening of a fresh pig. Or she stood with her body reeled in like a kite. Or one from Send Nudes: this is the worst part of her day, having to confront herself like this. And I was just kind of thinking, like, on a sentence level or a stylistic level, how do you feel like you developed your own writing voice? And I know you mentioned some of your influences earlier, but I was wondering more on like a linguistic level, kind of like what kind of writers make you excited?
Mm. I think like in terms of style or voice. I really like it was Laurie Moore and probably Mary Gateskill who really like just put forward a voice that I felt like, yeah, I guess I just found it inspiring, you know. I felt like it could, and they're also working with women and with themes that I always knew were probably going to be my themes or my topics. um I think it's like, yeah, there is like a cleanness, but there's also, particularly with Mary Gates, actually with both, like a kind of trippiness, which I really was struck by. Like it doesn't feel sanitized in the way that some writers, like some styles do. It's like you can lean into this quite weird moment in a Mary Gateskill or Laurie Moore um, story, or yeah, and I think that was something that I probably tried to bring into my own writing. Um, the kind of the stripped backness of it, I also think is very just like of our time. Like when I was learning to write, that was it was that was what I was reading, I guess. And also doing creative writing courses, I feel like often there is a mode of short stories that you're given in a creative writing classroom, and generally it's on that side, which I'm not saying is like necessarily right, but I do think it's true. That's what I came to, you know. Like I did an undergraduate creative writing, and then I did a master's in creative writing, so really I was just kind of like from 18 looking at short stories for quite a long time that teachers were handing me, and it was great, but also there is a certain style, and that style I probably didn't see that there was anything else, so that side of it um, developed more because I probably didn't know an alternative. um, and yeah, and now when I read something that's like poetic, I'm like, I just read a passage North by Anukarad Pragasam, and I was just like so in love with it, you know, because it feels quite rare for me, and it feels like completely not a place where I'm at in my own writing, and it yeah, it's really nice to be with a voice that's not your own or similar to your own, and yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I think so much of learning to write is learning how to speak kind of in your own voice, or like to feel like a true voice come to the surface. And obviously that's informed by like everything you've ever read. You know, it's not just something that is innate. It's like something that you develop and something that, you know, you're influenced by other writers. I also wanted to ask you about food because I feel like food is quite present in this collection, and it holds lots of different emotions for your characters. So it can be kind of a place of fear and repression, like for your protagonist in Send Nudes, or in Here Alone, there's a kind of like joy and liberation to it. Or in Tinderloin, it's almost like the butchery could kind of represent like the protagonist's desire to gain control over her own body or her inability to. And I was just wondering why you were interested in exploring food and why you feel like it's something that can hold all of these different conflicting emotions.
Mm. Oh, food is so many things to me. Food was never a like conscious decision. I think I like food, and I associate so many scenes. You know, it's like, and when I read a book and there's no food in it, I'm just like, well, you guys had to eat, you know. And I think that's that's often how it was. And sometimes it's like scenery, like in the with the butcher. Um, it's not so much to do with what they're eating, and yeah, the preparation, and just like the scene that allows for, um, is interesting. And at the same, I think, with the bread, like that's another food story that was probably the only other time when it felt conscious. I was like, okay, this is what I want to do, and this is how, yeah, this is how I'm going to do it. But with, like, in places like snake bite, or like the food in like flying kite, or where they really are just eating, um, and it can say so much about like the moment that they're in. Like, I feel like snake bite has this real like chemical, fake foods, um, like super noodles and cheese what's it or whatever, and that feels kind of cultural, like a cultural moment, I think. um, yeah, I guess it's similar to the moments of pop culture that we were talking about earlier, like the kind of surfacing of detail that, might make a reader, uh, like ground a reader in the moment. I think food is really great to do that with. Um, but it's also like it can say so much about a relationship, like who's cooking for who, and like Meg's always making Lara sandwiches and snakebite, and I think that, it's a very simple way of just like foregrounding a relationship, like this is what's going on here. Um, and then at the same time it builds a world, like, in Flying Kite, the kind of food that she eats with when she's at home with her birth mother, compared to the food she eats with her foster family, is like just like a way of dividing these worlds that, feels feels quite simple, but also it's fun. It's fun to imagine. I mean, I'm just rambling now, but it's really fun to be like, this is the kind of food they would eat. For me, that's like the detail of writing is probably most what I'm in it for. Um, and kind of the moments of my day where I'm like, oh, okay, I get to put this in now. So yeah.
Yeah, I think also food can be a big signifier of class. So, yeah,
Mm,
in the kite story, kind of the protagonist is in this kind of hippie yoga world where they eat like hummus and like homemade bread. And when she thinks of her birth mother, it's like she eats like jelly snakes or like
mm,
something crumbled into yogurt. What is it crumbled into yogurt?
yeah, Chris, salt and vinegar,
Yeah.
Chris. Mm,
Yeah, and I feel like you're
yeah.
right in like it does explore class, but in a very kind of nuanced way, and it's not like on the
Mm,
nose, in a way that I appreciated. And especially today's Square, which is the last story in your collection, I think it's probably like the only writing about the pandemic that I've enjoyed at all. And I think the reason for that is because you're ex it's set within the lockdown world, and it's based on a mother and child who live in a block of flats, and they booked like their second holiday ever to go to Tenerife, and they couldn't go because of the lockdown. And I think because it was set within the world of the lockdown, or referencing the lockdown, but it is saying something else. And I just wondered, yeah, were you in lockdown when you wrote that story? Did you Why did you feel like it was important to look at it through a kind of class-based lens?
mm. Yeah, I was in lockdown when I wrote that story, and I actually didn't write it for the collection. I didn't want to put a pandemic story in. Um, I wrote it for somewhere else, and then ended up really liking it, and then it went in. Um, and it was the very beginning of the pandemic, so I remember there were a lot of details in it that my editor was like, "Well, like this never happened." This like, at one point they couldn't go outside and stuff, and because of law, and and yeah, so I had to change like various details about it, but I mean, yeah, it was early lockdown, and class felt so prominent. It was just like who has a garden, who, who has access to this and who doesn't, and who can stay home and homeschool their kids and who can't. And it was so it was so at the surface of like the change in state. Um, and yeah, it was I just that story again, I wrote it quite quickly and I wrote it for somewhere else. Um, but that was really, I think, what I was thinking about was the way that class and the pandemic were meeting. And yeah, in that story, like, yeah, the mum saved up for their holiday for however long, a long time, and then, can't work anymore and has to spend the money on just like living. And um and it's not even the fact that the holiday can't happen, it's the fact that there's no money and the holiday will never happen. And um and yeah, I yeah, it was like an interesting time to write a story. I was living at my mum's in Brighton, and it was like, I remember just like not really reading or writing or concentrating on anything, and not really being able to write anything that wasn't about the pandemic, but also not wanting to write about the pandemic because it was such early days and it was so. And yeah, and then that story just kind of happened, and I was like, oh, like, I'd never done. I don't think I'd ever done that before, like been so been so informed by something that's going on in the world in my fiction. Um, so yeah.
Yeah, or I guess I think a lot of your writing kind of explores the weight of things or the cost of certain situations for different people, and I guess that like um, the family in this story who can't go on their holiday, it has a very different cost. I mean, metaphorically, but also literally for like kind of maybe more affluent families who just miss their summer holiday 1 year, and that's that.
Hmm.
Um, but yeah, I think what's really appealing about your characters is that they all, pretty much all of them, undergo some kind of change in your stories. And it's a kind of seismic change within themselves, which to other people can be like barely perceptible. So I'm thinking about particularly the story Overnight, where the protagonist kind of bumps into someone who has assaulted her in the past and kind of she figures out how she feels about it in her own mind. And I feel like particularly um, your narrators, their relationships with their bodies change, or their relationships with their pasts, or their relationships to their obsessions change. And I was wondering why you feel interested in this kind of like interior moment of change rather than, some large action or dramatic event that happens in the outside world of the story, why you feel drawn to those kind of, yeah, like imperceptible but also seismic kind of inner changes that your characters go through.
I think that um, I think that those I think the inner changes just felt more real to me. I think they felt more consistent with like the way that um, the way that we live our lives. Um, I also, I mean, yeah, I think if I'm being honest with myself, it's also more like doable within the size of a short story, and um, within like how confident I was as a writer when I was writing them. Yeah, when I guess when you've just got like kind of one central character or maybe two, um, how much drama coming from the outside can you really fit in? And yeah, those quiet moments in fiction are probably yeah, really what I relate to, and really what I enjoy and appreciate, I think, in fiction. I think there's something fiction can do something with inner change that not that many other art forms can do. I think. Um, yeah, I knew that with my stories, I wanted to work towards or consider some moment of like elevation above the reality, like some moment of pleasure or retribution or joy. And yeah, that sometimes it's the kind of joy that you would look back in 10 years and be like, oh no, that wasn't joy. Or or um sometimes it really is like a seismic, like, oh no, okay, this girl's been changed forever. um but I think with each story I would get to a point of being like, okay, I want them to feel something positive in this moment now. and and that often became what I was working towards. Or because you come to care about that character and you want to see them just in a moment, like, be pleased with themselves. And yeah.
And finally, I wanted to ask you, kind of as a short story writer, I know you said you are also writing a novel now, so that might give you a different perspective. Like, what do you feel are some of the freedoms and limitations of the short story form?
mm, the size of them is like, I find it so freeing. I think if you're a novel writer, it would be a limitation. But for me, and just like the kind of writer that I was when I was writing them, the kind of time that I had for writing, it was so suited to a short story. And you I'm not saying that my stories can take on what a novel can take on, or even try, but they don't need to. Um it's about a moment in a life, and I again I think that's what the kind of quietness, or the internal nature of that is what I love about reading and also about writing. um and yeah, a short story that you can take that as like the kernel, and then you can just build around that, and it feels possible. And then you finish it, and then you go back and read it next week, and it takes you like half an hour. And that the time of that is precious. I think, like, we don't all have, you know all day to sit down and write, and I definitely didn't. Um and short stories made it feel possible for me to be a writer and also be the other things I was being at the time. And um, so yeah, for me, the length of them was the huge freedom. Um, but and also I think that means you can pay attention to every word. And when you read out some of my sentences, like, I know those sentences, I know every sentence, and it's a short book anyway. But also because of the size of the stories, it's like every word really did feel considered. And I think that's a really special place to be as well, with your writing. um, Limitations, I don't know. I think I could get back to you in a long time when I've managed to write my novel. um, because at the moment I'm in a place where I just really like, I love short stories and I miss writing them. um, and yeah, so it's hard for me to think about them negatively. But I'm sure when, or fingers crossed, like, when I have experience of writing novels, it brings a confidence as well as a writer. I think when you're kind of like balancing like these huge scenes, and like solving puzzles within your novel, and all of these things that I'm sure can be amazing, and to me just feel right now really daunting. And So yeah, I'm sure like the short story form does not give space to a writer at like the height of their powers, but I wasn't that, so that they were perfect.
Yeah, I mean, I don't know. I think writing a good short story is very, very difficult. I think writing a novel is hard because you have to really persevere. It's an act of perseverance. But a short story, to pull off an effective short story, I think can be more difficult because you have much less space to express what you want to say, whereas in a novel you have a lot more space to explain yourself. But I really
Mm.
like what you said about writing short stories allowed you to be a writer and also to be everything else you were at the time. Because, yeah, that's what everyone is trying to do all of the time. And I think there are often so many barriers to becoming a writer, like people don't have the time or it all feels very daunting. So I think that is a very good ethos that you have to be a writer, but you also have to be everything else in your life. Um, and that feels like a really nice note to end on. So it was a real pleasure to chat to you, Saba. Yeah, thank you for being so generous with your time.
Well, thank you so much. Yeah, it's been great. The questions were so, yeah, you made me think about things about my book that I hadn't thought about, so I really appreciate that.
And Saba's book, Send Nudes, is out now and it's published by Bloomsbury.